Well, welcome everyone to our next webinar from the Collaborative for Leadership in Errors Sensory Integration. Tonight we are really honored and excited to hopefully get to spend some time with Dr. Shelly Lane, who is with us, I believe, from Australia. I don't think she's in the US right now. She's been working in Australia. And unfortunately, she just was evacuated from her building with a fire alarm. So we're hoping that it's just a routine alarm and that Shelly will be back soon. But to stay on time, we thought that we would go ahead and skip to what we usually talk about at the end of the webinars, which is just a little bit of an overview of our program. And in this classroom, we can give each of you microphones and open up your audio if you'd like to have any questions or discussion. We usually do that at the end of the session. So in the meantime, however, you can type any comments or questions that you might have in the chat box, and hopefully all of you can see that over on the right side of your screen. So just to go ahead and give you a little bit of information about our program, if it's not familiar to you. I see some familiar names, so I know some of you know quite well about CLASI and the certificate in error sensory integration that we've developed. But we have had, Dr. Suzanne Smith-Rowley and myself founded CLASI because we have had a long history of being committed to this important work that Dr. Ayers developed, and especially to training and developing competency levels around the concepts of error sensory integration. And there have been a number of programs over the decades since Dr. Ayers developed this work. And we felt that there was a little bit of a gap currently in training, especially in the United States. We have been really honored to work with our colleagues all over the globe and to see some very strong organizations develop in sensory integration who have vibrant and very credible training programs. And we thought that there was a need for this in the United States as well. And so that was our impetus behind launching this organization with a focus on having strong and scholarly training in this framework. So we had an opportunity in starting a new program to really think about the core elements that we thought would be vital, and also to think about the delivery, given that we're in a newer century and a time with technology. We realized that we had the opportunity to have both online and on-site courses. I do see that Shelly is back. So Shelly, I'm going to give, why don't you go ahead and try to connect your microphone. As a presenter, Shelly, you should be able to connect your audio, and let's see if we can hear you. And I'll just keep going until we hear your voice, and then we'll make a switch. And Shelly, if you are here, and unless did she just stay as a presenter when she left the room, Katie? Do you think that she hasn't come back actually?
It looks like there's still the guest individual, the original Shelly guest signed in. I'm not sure if another participant named Shelly who signed in, or if perhaps I don't see it.
Well, I moved the original Shelly up to presenter. So I'm sorry, everyone. Guest number 2.
Oh, there we go.
Oh, and then there's Shelly. Okay.
And it looks like both of those people are joining. I believe that icon indicates that they're joining from their phone.
Okay. Well, if Shelly Lane is in the room at the moment, could she please type in the box? If Shelly, who's listed and guest 2 are not Shelly Lane, that's okay. But if either one of you happen to be Shelly Lane back from your fire alarm evacuation, then please type in the box. And in the meantime, I'll just keep going until we hear from someone. So what I was saying was that at this time, we did realize that we had an opportunity to think about the best learning methods. And with technology, we thought that there was certain content in our program that is quite detailed, takes a lot of thought and time to digest and review. And so we decided that some of the content would probably be better learned online, where learners would have the opportunity to go at their own pace, to come back and review both immediately after they finish lessons and perhaps months later after they've gone on to other levels. So in our certificate program, we start with theory, which is an ever-evolving set of concepts, and which can be both interesting and challenging and somewhat dense at the same time, because these lessons include neurobiology and brain functions and a lot of important but sometimes challenging concepts to grasp. So we thought it would be best to put our theory lessons online, again, so they could be accompanied by graphics and videos and reviewed over time. Our second module, which is also online, also includes a lot of detail. And in our online module 2, learners are introduced to and have specific training in the detailed administration and scoring of assessment tools. Dr. Ayers was always quite committed to comprehensive assessment, and we continue to share that dedication that she helped us to understand as being so important. So currently, this year and into the next year or so, we are training on the sensory integration and praxis tests. These have been very important tests that Dr. Ayers developed and have held up over a long period of time to provide very comprehensive and necessary details in understanding the children before we go on to intervention. We also have been involved in the development of a new set of tests, the evaluation in Ayers sensory integration. Some of you have probably heard a lot about the EASY. Maybe for some of you it's still a newer idea. But we will have a new set of tests, 20 tests. We've just finalized the last test this week. And we'll have a new set of tests that will be open access, and that means that they'll be free to to professionals who have the appropriate credentials. And these tests will be standardized internationally. We will begin the international normative data collection later into the summer, fall, depending on where you live in the world, but around August or September of this year. So we're currently providing an introduction to the EASY, starting to use some of the tests, and over time we believe that any of our learners who learn both the SIPT and the EASY will be able to transition between those tests, and if they're finding that the EASY meets their needs, they will have a very almost free, affordable way to complete their assessments. And then we have an on-site course where we really practice with mentorship and have the chance to try out those assessment tools after having some study time, rather than hearing about the assessments, trying to understand them, track all the details, and then practice immediately. Instead, we wait and have the practice after there's been that chance to study online. Oh, Rick. Okay, so that's Rick. We have the whole Lane Thornton family online with us. That's so great. Where's your sister, Lucas? Okay, so Rick said he just talked to Shelly. She's still outside, but she'll be back in 5 to 10 minutes. That is great. And hopefully we can get her connected. And the timing will be just right. That's great. Okay, so then after the on-site module 3, which is the mentored practice of the assessment tools, we come back to online courses. Module 4 is a clinical reasoning course that involves, again, some details related to statistics and some of the psychometric properties of tests, and to the research that covers many decades that helps us to understand how to interpret the test findings. And then we go on to Module 5, which is a set of lessons that are an introduction to intervention and include training in how to use the AIRS sensory integration fidelity measure. The fidelity measure is a tool that was originally designed for research purposes, but it has turned out to have a great deal of value to clinicians who want to refine and focus their intervention skills. So those 2 courses take place online, and then our learners come together for a second on-site course, Module 6, in which they share case interpretation and take that case information directly into treatment. The Module 6 includes intervention demonstrations and a lot of discussion around the interpretation of the assessment as well as the treatment that would be appropriate for those children, including looking at goals and outcome measures and follow-up to determine if the intervention was effective. So that is an overview of our program. These slides that follow review that. I probably could have been showing these as we went. I think that's what you were trying to tell me, Katie. I'll just briefly go through them. This slide is a little bit of an overview of the constructs that we try to cover in assessment. We are really trying to move away from an idea of being SIPT certified or EASY certified. We hope that our learners have a broad overview of the main constructs in sensory integration so that they can be thinking about the variety of tools that they might access in order to conduct an appropriate assessment. And so the main constructs that we know about from previous research, and we'll continue to refine this as we move forward, is that we cover problems in multiple areas of sensory perception, problems related to postural, ocular, and bilateral integration, problems in praxis, and sensory over and under reactivity. Shelly, that is great that you're back. Let's go ahead and get your sound, make sure that we can hear you, and then we'll have Katie go ahead and put the slides back to the beginning. Katie, you could go ahead and get the PowerPoint ready, and I think Shelly may be connecting. We can hear you. Wow.
Can you hear me? And there's no fire
and your
alarm.
whole family's here.
Honestly, really? Well, so this is why we need to understand neuroscience, because I'm going to be a little bit
No
flustered.
problem. Well, welcome back, Shelly. Take a deep breath. I'll let you introduce yourself. And we went on and covered the end of the webinar. So now the floor is yours. And I'm going to go on mute. Go ahead.
And Shelly, quickly before we get started, the video Zoe and I tested out, what works best is actually if I do a screen share. So when we get to the slides with the videos, I'm just going to quickly share my computer screen with the group and allow everyone to watch the videos that way.
Okay, that sounds
so it'll
great.
take a quick second once we get there, and I will share my screen.
All right. Thank you very much. Yes, so I'm Shelly. I'm talking to you from Australia, and we did in fact just have a very long fire alarm, and it was apparently a real fire, so hence the length of the evacuation. I was trying to hide in my office with the door locked and the lights off, and I got busted. So at any rate, I don't know what else you need to know about me, and maybe we should just move forward. Do I have control over the slides?
You do? Do you see the little arrows in the bottom left-hand?
Oh, yes, I do. Okay, excellent. So, we're talking today about why neuroscience matters. And one of the things that we have to start with here is understanding what neuroscience is, and probably you all know that. But I was particularly taken with this definition written by the Invigorate Royal Society because of how it presents neuroscience. And it talks about neuroscience as more than just the study of the brain and the nervous system, which is where we begin here, but it is about the brain. That is an organ that enables us to adapt to our environments and to learn. And it goes on to say that studying neuroscience helps us to understand that the brain is constantly changing and that everything we do changes the brain. And for me, that embodies what's important about neuroscience to occupational therapy. And so why does neuroscience matter? Well, I'm sure you're well aware that you can't really go anywhere anymore or read anything anymore without seeing some headline about neuroscience. So what I did was I grabbed a couple of headlines from various different sources. On this slide, you see neurosciencenews.com, and you see Flipboard's Brain and Neuroscience section. And you can look at the topics that are covered here, and they're relevant to occupational therapy, but they're also relevant to the world at large. And because neuroscience is becoming an everyday language, it's crucial that we as OTs learn this, essentially, this different language, so that we can explain to a client we're working with who has a traumatic brain injury why their gut may be differently functioning now based on this story from Neuroscience News. If we look at Flipboard, we can see the bottom bullet there. What's happening to your brain to make that chocolate bar, cigarette, or new purse feel so good? So it's everywhere. The BBC News, the NBC News, various different podcasts, they all have pieces on neuroscience. And some of them are about self-help, like your smartphone is changing the human race in surprising ways. And others are really important for us to understand in cases of disability. And those would be better reflected on the headlines from the previous slide. You can get news, and then you can go to these podcasts. And in these podcasts, I didn't list the topics, but rather just a series of different podcasts that talk about the brain. And they talk about the brain in a typically developing person as well as somebody who has a disability. So we need to understand neuroscience because we need to be able to talk to our clients, and probably a little bit of self-help for our own personal needs as well. On this slide, I've listed some books for the lay reader on neuroscience. And of course, there is a Neuroscience for Dummies. There's a Complete Idiot's Guide to Understanding the Brain, but there's also some other ones here that are along the lines of self-help. And others, like the Oliver Sacks books, that talk about neuroscience phenomena. What's the message that we get? Well, the message here is that in order to see yourself through the eyes of the modern neuroscientist, it turns out not only provides a means of self-understanding that can be new and inspiring, but it brings together multiple disciplines. And so for occupational therapy, neuroscience isn't just about you and your client and your client's family, but it's about you being able to converse with other professionals who are also working with your client. And this quote from the Rady book, and the Rady book is the one that's the user's guide, ends with, suddenly for us the world has gone from flat to round. So suddenly for us, we're looking at complexity rather than just the image that's before our eyes. And I think that that becomes really important. So people do want to learn more about the brain and understand more, but the topic of why neuroscience matters is way too big. It's huge. It covers everything. So we can narrow that down to why neuroscience for occupational therapy. Because even if you look back at some of those headlines, things like gut bacteria and emotion, that's important to us as OTs. Understanding motivation, like needing that chocolate bar, that's important to us as OTs. Why you still get that anxiety about going back to school, and as an adult it might not be back to school, but it's that entering a new phase. That's certainly important to us as OTs. But even just trying to apply it to occupational therapy is way, way, way too big. So, because this is a classy seminar, we're going to focus on why neuroscience in terms of occupational therapists who use the approach of sensory integration in their clinical practice. And when we go there, we know that Ayers built her theory on an understanding of neuroscience. And so I have a series of quotes from Ayers on the next several slides because they're really poignant. And she says, some problems rather, like measles or broken bones or poor eyesight, are obvious. Others, such as problems with learning, poor behavior, those are not so obvious. And it's because sensory integrative problems are not obvious yet, cause so much trouble, that they need to be explained. And so in 1981, she told us you might not be used to thinking of the brain as the director of all activity, but the book that she put together, which was SI and the Child, was designed to give us a different way of looking at and teasing apart learning and behavior. And so, as I said, I've got some quotes from Ayers on the next several slides. And I did that because it helps us direct where we need to focus our energy. So Ayers tells us countless bits of sensory information enter our brain at every moment. The brain must organize all of these sensations if a person is to move, learn, and behave normally. So the need to know message here is, how in the world does the brain do that? And if we don't understand neuroscience, we can't understand what she's saying here. She says you can think of sensations as food for the brain. They provide energy and knowledge needed to direct the body and the mind. But without well-organized sensory processes, sensations cannot be digested and nourish the brain. And honestly, I love thinking of sensation as food for the brain. But the need to know here from a neuroscience perspective is, how in the world does the brain digest sensation so that sensation can, in fact, be nourishment? Ayers tells us that countless bits of sensory information enter our brain at every moment. And the brain needs to organize those sensations if a person is to move, learn, and behave normally. Our need to know there is, how does the brain do that? What's involved with that? What is it that goes awry when that doesn't happen? Ayres tells us, that we can think of, I think I just did this. Maybe I didn't progress the slide. Oh, I see what's happening. Okay. Ayres asks us to think about eating an orange, and she goes into the various different aspects of sensation that we get from that orange. But she says that we have to integrate that information. And so our need to know there is, how does that integration take place? Where does that integration take place? And extending that, can it still take place if there's a problem in the brain? Ayres tells us that until about the age of 7, the brain is primarily a sensory processing machine. And this means that it senses things and derives meaning from sensation. And our need to know there is, how does sensory processing link to motor output, to emotional response, to attention, to arousal? How do we extract meaning from sensation? There's an interesting discussion going on in the neuroscience literature, asking first, do brains control behavior? And what you see on this slide is an image, a phrenology image, and what you see listed are functions or behaviors that are associated with different regions of the brain. So there is a behavior called ideality and sublimity and cautiousness, and those are all specifically linked to different places in the brain, or they were back when phrenology was the big thing, suggesting that those behaviors were controlled by these regions of the brain. But if we flip that, we can ask, do brains adapt behavior in order to get the sensation that supports function? And again, this is, to me, a phrase that captures what happens when we talk about sensory integration. The bottom line, though, is that we can't just study neuroscience. We can't just study behavior. We have to put it together as a package, because until it's a package, we don't really get the whole picture. So when I talk about the importance of neuroscience, I don't want you to even consider putting it in vacuum, because neuroscience and behavior are what come together to help us understand children. And I've added a third bubble to this slide, and that is context, because we all know that context influences the sensation that we take in, the integrative process that we engage in, and the behavior that comes out the other side. So there are some definitions here where neuroscience is defined as sciences that deal with structure and or function of the nervous system and the brain. And we're going to come back to that idea in a few slides. And then in the second bullet there, I've just listed a number of different aspects of science that relate to neuroscience. If you look up at the top, the circle that I've labeled behavior, how do we define behavior? Behavior can be defined as movements that serve a purpose and a way in which one conducts oneself. The third circle there is context. And we're not going to really look at context in this presentation, but I want you to always have context in your head. because context is the surround. It is the circumstances that surround behavior. There are an array of variables that influence performance, and you can find those in the occupational therapy, the OTPS, practice framework. And context is more than just physical. It's social, temporal, spatial. And I know you all probably are aware of that. But for me, it's important to always come back to the big picture. And neuroscience is only one part of that big picture. So if we just studied behavior, we would have a lot of information about observation. So, Katie, this is where that video goes, the treatment session.
That's perfect. Give me 1 second and I'll share my screen with everyone so that they can watch that.
What I want you to think about as you watch this little video clip is what you see. Ooh, slow-mo. All right, and we don't have sound. Katie warned me we might not. So this is a therapy session. The little boy's name is Rory, and what he wants to do is jump off the loft and land in the pillows. The first jump he makes is precariously close to the ramp, and the therapist takes a hold of him because he's ready to just run and do it again, and she says, that was really, really, really scary for me. So let's figure out how to give you another cue in order to make it safer. Meanwhile, Rory is going to throw the ball. And she says, this is your spot. I want you to jump from this spot if you're going to jump into the pillows. There we go. And then she decides he needs something more physical. So she gets a piece of paper, and that's now Rory's jumping spot. Because Rory's not taking in the context here. He's not understanding that he really doesn't want to hit his head on that ramp. And so she's providing him with a really simple, enhanced sensation here to make the activity safe. So you can see, even in slow motion, you can see, just make some observations for yourself on how Rory does going up the ramp, what he does up at the top, and also how repetitive his behavior is. So the therapist saw him hopping on the top of the loft and decides to capitalize on that to increase the complexity of his motor output just a little bit. Have another look at it. So she asks him to hop inside the inner tube. And I want you to think about what you're seeing here as Rory tries to hop inside the inner tube. And then he goes back to his comfort zone, the pillows. Okay, so we should go back then to the slides. Thanks so much, Katie. So what that observation also allows us to do is not just see behaviors, but to link behaviors. And so what we see with Rory is that he likes doing this jumping off the loft, and he does it again and again and again. And it's pretty straightforward. It's very simple. He has a great deal of fun. It's too bad we didn't have the audio on there, because he really does like it. But when the therapist tries to make it into something a little bit more than that and asks him to do the hopping inside the barrel, the inner tube, what we see is that Rory has a little bit more trouble here. His balance isn't ideal. So we can maybe make a link between his balance as he tries to hop inside the inner tube and what happens when he goes back to this comfort behavior of walking up the ramp a little wobbly as he walks up and then jumping into the pillows. And we can say that maybe his poor balance is part of the reason that he sticks with this relatively repetitive and simple activity. He does like the movement. He gets a lot of deep pressure when he bounces into or drops into the pillows. And so we have a series of behaviors that we can link together. But just looking at behaviors doesn't tell us why. Why isn't his balance great? Why does that lead him to do very simple activities like just running and jumping off the loft? And importantly, how can we move to the next step? If we just looked at context, we would get a good sense about how the environment influenced behavior. We would learn about ideal and less than ideal environments and contexts for that little person. And we could develop a plan to create ideal context. But if we just look at context, it doesn't answer the what question. It doesn't tell us about what's happening. So we need the why from behavior. We need the what from context. What's happening in the nervous system? And then if we just focused on neuroscience, we'd be neuroscientists. We would understand brain chemistry, cellular mechanisms, groupings into structures, neural circuits, etc. We would be able to consider how a healthy nervous system works and produces thought, emotion, and behavior. And maybe we could understand how the central nervous system acts to regulate important body functions. But neuroscience doesn't give us the whole picture, neuroscience alone. It doesn't tell us about the strengths and needs of individual children. It doesn't tell us what to evaluate. It doesn't tell us how the current skills stack up to expectations. It also doesn't tell us about the strengths and the weaknesses of various environments that we find ourselves and our children in. And so we really do need to study all three. And you probably knew that already. It gives us the big picture, and it gives us, for lack of a better term, the context into which to fit the neuroscience. But neuroscience is huge. So what is it that we need to know, and where should we start? How do we begin to learn about how brain function links to behavior? We can start here with the anatomy of functional brain areas. Katie, this one's working.
Share the screen again?
We don't have to because this was working.
Oh, it is. Okay. Never mind. Let me hide this. Perfect.
So knowing the basics of brain structure is a really good place to start. It is what will give us, if you look in the upper right-hand corner there, where I have Bloom's taxonomy, we're going to be down at the bottom of that pyramid in remembering. But we have to start here. We have to be able to remember the basic structures of the brain. So we're seeing the lobes here. In a minute, this will show you other regions of the brain. And this is where we start. But we can't stay here because this is too basic. This is not going to give us the information that we really need in order to fully understand our kids. So we then move to understanding function. Oops, Katie, this one doesn't seem.
Yeah, I don't think we're seeing the video, Shelly, so Katie's going to put it up now.
Hopefully everyone can see that now.
Well, I know I can see it. But
Great.
what this is taking that same brain and breaking it apart into function. So if we get structure from the previous slide and move into understanding function, it moves us up on the hierarchy of knowledge. We now can both understand and begin to apply this information that we get. And I have my box up there around understanding and into the aqua colored box, which is application. And if we understand function and structure, then we can begin to hypothesize about behaviors and context and how those interact. We can consider where strengths and weaknesses might be in the brain and answer some pretty basic questions just knowing general structure and function. And so then we pair those two up and we can use it clinically. But we need to go beyond that too, because we're not going to be content with those sort of broad brushstrokes of understanding. And so we have to get our heads around central nervous system systems. And what I've got here on the slide focuses on the vestibular system. And I've put now Bloom's taxonomy of knowledge down in the bottom corner. And once we start to understand systems, we move our knowledge base into applying and analyzing and creating a plan. And so once we start understanding systems, we can engage in the process that Roseanne Schaff was talking about in the last webinar, and that is data-driven decision-making. If you have a look at the images that I've put on this slide, the one on your left shows links between the vestibular system and the oculomotor system. And this is the foundation for understanding nystagmus and for understanding how we can move through the world and not have the world be all fuzzy as our head moves around. And although we think our heads are fairly stable on our bodies as we move through the world, in reality we're bobbleheads. And if we didn't have the vestibular system acting to help us stabilize that visual field, then we become less functional. The middle slide shows you vestibular descending pathways. And these descending pathways are for postural control. They control extension. We can activate those descending pathways using many of the techniques that we use in sensory integration therapy. Riding a scooter board down a ramp, that linear movement activates the part of the vestibular system that feeds into these descending vestibulospinal pathways and contribute to our ability to stand upright against gravity and to maintain postural stability. The last image here has, at the bottom of that image, are the 4 vestibular nuclei. And without going through all of those various different connections, what you see is that those vestibular nuclei connect to multiple different areas in the brain. And if we can understand the vestibular system and its upper, higher level connections, then we can understand what impact things like poor balance might have on other activities in the nervous system. And as we then as we develop the skills to enable us to put these pieces together, we're better at understanding behavior. We're better at understanding how behavior changes with context. And we're better then at knowing what to evaluate and how to treat. Beyond systems, and systems are crucial to understand, but if we go the next step, we have to get into much more complex interactions. And you can see those depicted here on the left with the connectivity diagram. If we can appreciate brain networks and connectivity, then we've gone a long way towards understanding our kids and being able to figure out how to interact with them. It gives these networks are all about understanding interactions from one structure to another. And that takes us back then to looking at those structures and their functions, because the functions of any given structure, it's not just one function. Generally speaking, there are multiple functions for each structure in the nervous system. If you just take the thalamus, for instance, the thalamus is a conduit for sensory information that goes up to higher levels, but it has multiple different regions that process sound and vision and touch and movement. And while we'd like to think that, oh yeah, the medial geniculate nucleus is our sound nucleus in the thalamus, medial geniculate nucleus also receives vestibular inputs. And so understanding that connectivity in those networks gives us more insight into why we can influence the auditory language system through movement, for instance. So it becomes important to appreciate networks and connectivity, and yet many of us probably aren't quite there yet. And neural networks have been talked about in the neuroscience literature since the late 90s. So we're not talking about new constructs here, but we are talking about complex constructs. And initially there were 5 core neural networks identified, but over the last 20 years, those have become more or less refined. And still there's inconsistency in the neuroscience literature about these networks, but I'm going to present to you what is the most consistent in terms of neural networks, because I think they will help us to understand our kids better. So the first one here is the default mode network, and this is the network that is active during wakeful rest. So this is the one that's active when we're thinking about ourselves, when we're thinking about others, when we're pondering the past or planning for the future, but not when we're doing. So this is a sort of a self-reflective network that doesn't have to have external goals attached to it, but rather is our cogitation about what happened, what's next, and where do I want to go. And interestingly, connectivity in this particular neural network is associated with problems that we see in the clinic on a daily basis. It's associated with things like impaired social interaction and communication in children with autism. It's associated with poor attachment plans in children who have been exposed to trauma, and that should have been attachment patterns, sorry about that. But we don't even think about these neural networks when we think about those kids, and yet I think if we can understand neural networks, we can use that clinically. The second neural network that I want to talk about is the one called the salience network. And this is detecting and filtering salient stimuli. And honestly, isn't this what sensory integration is really all about? This network is also then an integrative network of emotional and sensory input. So this is how we might see that very emotional response to touch in a child who has tactile defensiveness, for instance. Another interesting thing about the salience network is that it coordinates that resting, wakeful rest network that we just talked about, and the central executive network, which we haven't talked about yet. But it's the intermediary between two other very complex neural processes. And this salience network is found to be problematic in anxiety disorders. And kids come to us with anxiety disorders. Kids come to us having experienced post-traumatic stress disorder. So this understanding the impact of context on how this network works becomes important for us clinically. And the central executive network is the last major network, and these are called broad networks in the literature. And this is higher cognitive function, working memory, problem solving, decision making, goal-oriented tasks, attentional control. What we know about this network is that it requires an integrative brain. It requires that all of the other lower pieces are working in order for us to be able to engage in these higher cognitive functions. And so when we have little people in our clinics who don't have good control of their autonomic nervous system, who can't process touch and movement very well, we can't necessarily expect optimal memory, problem solving, and decision making from them because the lower level networks just aren't giving them the support they need. So then we come to what is my last slide. What else is there to understand in neuroscience? Well, we've gone through structure, function, and gone into systems and neural networks, and all of that is really pretty complicated. If you can get there, you'll have some really nice insight into the kids you treat. But other things that you might want to consider looking at are details of sensory reception and transmission. So, for instance, knowing that what is interpreted as painful stimuli in kids with tactile defensiveness, that stimuli is picked up by receptors that are attached to neural fibers carrying the sensation of discomfort to the central nervous system, but they carry it over fibers that are very small in diameter and not myelinated. So the information goes slowly to the central nervous system. We know that we can dampen the effect of that painful perception on the child by using something like deep pressure or proprioception. And that works because the receptors that are responsible for detecting deep pressure and proprioception, carry information to the nervous system across fibers that are bigger diameter and well myelinated. So that information gets to the central nervous system faster. And it helps us understand why we rub a spot when it hurts, why our kids with tactile defensiveness do well in the pillows that you saw Rory jumping into and making a sandwich out of them, because it changes how the nervous system responds to the input based on how the information is received peripherally and transmitted to the brain. I promise I won't go into that much detail on all the rest of these bullet points, but it might be important to understand things like cellular metabolism and blood supply. It might be important to understand the role of neurotransmitters, and I know many of you are working with kids with autism. It's a very well studied area, and there are neurotransmitter deficits in kids, differences in kids with autism. We could look at differences between left and right brain processing, which can give us some insight, particularly into higher level cortical thinking, more that executive network, but also into emotional control and the link between emotion and cognition. We could look at gender differences. We could understand the brain in specific diseases. We could look at the aging nervous system, etc., etc., etc. So what I leave you with, and where I'll stop on this, is a question for you, and that is, what else will help you to understand, to assess, and treat the children that you see? There are a myriad of things that we could get into. All right. So, why neuroscience? Well, because it's important, because it's everywhere, because we need to understand it, to understand our children, and yet it's not a standalone body of knowledge. And I think I'll stop there and open it up to questions.
Wow, Shelly, you just never cease to amaze me. You are such a gift to all of us. Thank you so, so much for that wonderful and thoughtful presentation. You are just amazing. And fire alarm and all. You don't even skip a beat. So if you have, I mean, we're about it. We try to keep these to an hour, but if you have maybe 5 more minutes, I'm just wondering if there are any questions from the group. If anyone would like to ask a question verbally, then I'll give you a microphone and explain how to connect, or you could type a question for Shelly in the chat box. And we'll give everyone a moment to see if anyone, I'm sure that everyone has a lot to think about. You've given us a lot to think about tonight. Or it's morning for you, I guess.
It is, yeah.
Okay. Are there any questions for Shelly? Any comments? Yeah, it's different. It's a little bit later in the day for, I think, many in the group. Maybe your husband has something to add. God, it was very helpful having him texting you and letting us know your whereabouts.
Oh my gosh, that was shocking. At any rate, let me say.
Look at that! Did you see that from your son? Best presentation ever. Oh, I guess I shouldn't say he's your son.
Yeah.
Everybody knows.
Loves me.
Yeah. We all love you, Shelly. Okay. All right. Well, we do have this recorded, and we will share the link if that's okay with you, Shelly. We'll be sharing it for anyone who might have missed.
Sure.
And okay. Well, and are you going to South Africa?
No, unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to get there.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll stop the recording. Let me do that. On.